The valley had seen hard winters before, but it had never seen anything like this. A mountain of a man, shoulders wise up door, beard thick as brush, standing alone in the freezing mud of a Wyoming riverbank, staring at a half-built sawmill rising out of nothing, out of debt and dark and a blind woman's impossible calculations. They had laughed. The whole town had laughed. Then the wheel turned. Then the blade sang. Then Silas Pruitt rode up that hill with a badge and a legal document and the absolute certainty that he had won. He was wrong. Because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the blind woman had been building her trap in the dark for 3 years before any of them thought to be afraid of her. And by the time they understood what she had built, it was already too late. The town sat in the valley like a bad tooth. Jagged peaks crowded it on 3 sides, cutting off the sun by 3 in the afternoon from October through April. The main street was mud and board and the particular kind of silence that settled over places where people had stopped expecting things to get better. Wade Harlan hated it, not personally, not the way you hated a man who had wronged you, the way you hated a place that had decided, collectively and without consultation, what kind of world it was going to be. Cold Creek had made its decision. It was going to be small and mean and certain of itself, and it was going to enforce that certainty on everyone who lived within range of its opinion. He came down from the timberline twice a year, October and March, not because he wanted the company, because coffee and salt and black powder didn't grow on ridge lines, and a man could only go so long without them before the wilderness stopped being a choice and started being a trap. He had a system: come down, trade the pelts, buy the supplies, leave before anyone tried to make conversation. 8 years of that system, 8 years of it working. He was built for the work he did and the life he lived. 6 feet and 4 inches of frame that had been hardened by altitude and labor and weather into something that bore only a passing resemblance to the softer version of men who lived in towns. His shoulders were wide enough to make door frames a structural consideration. His hands were the size of broadaxe heads. His beard was thick and dark and covered most of his expression, which was convenient because his expression was usually nothing most people wanted to see up close. He moved through Cold Creek's main street with a heavy, deliberate gait, not arrogance, physics. A man carrying a full pack of prime beaver and fox pelts down a frozen boardwalk moved differently than other men, and people stepped aside not out of courtesy but out of the same instinct that made deer move away from the shadow of something larger than themselves. They didn't like the mountain men. They liked the pelts. They liked the coin. They despised everything that came packaged with those things. The wilderness smell, the flat eyes that had looked at too much open sky and found the company of it better than what towns had to offer. Wade pushed through the heavy oak door of Gus Henley's mercantile. The air inside hit him first. Cured tobacco and damp wool and kerosene and the warmth of a cast-iron stove working itself hard in the corner. He dropped his bundle of pelts onto the wooden counter with a thud that sent a ripple of quiet through the room. Gus Henley. A thin man with ink-stained fingers and the expression of someone perpetually doing arithmetic they didn't like, began sorting through the furs with quick, practiced hands. Wade didn't watch him. He was already looking at the corner of the store, near the flour sacks, near the dried beans stacked to the ceiling. A woman stood with the stillness of someone who had learned through hard experience that stillness was its own kind of armor. She was wrapped in a gray wool shawl that had once been a different color. Her posture was straight, rigidly, precisely straight. In her right hand she held a smooth hickory cane, the wood worn pale and bright at the grip from years of daily use. Her eyes were pale, clouded over like glass left out in a hard frost. She was looking at nothing, seeing nothing, but listening to everything Wade knew of her. The way you knew of everyone in a valley this small and this mean. Ruth Calloway. Her husband Thomas had drowned in the Laramie River 3 years back, trying to save a load of building timber from a spring flood. Because Thomas Calloway had been the kind of man who tried to save things. A fever took her sight 14 months after that, not all at once. First the edges went soft, then the middle, then just darker. The town had pitied her, at first. Pity was a shallow well. It ran dry fast when the person you were pitying kept refusing to perform the right kind of grateful. Ruth Calloway had stopped performing grateful somewhere around month 3 of the blindness, and Cold Creek had never quite forgiven her for it. Standing in front of her was Silas Pruitt. The bank manager wore expensive woolen suits and a bowler hat that cost more than most families in this valley spent on food in a month. His face was soft and pink, the face of a man who had never split a cord of wood in his life and considered that a mark of distinction. He had positioned himself with his back to the room, which meant his voice carried to everyone in it. That was not an accident. I'm telling you for the last time, Ruth, loud and slow, the way people talked to children and animals and women they'd already decided weren't worth the full version of their attention. The grace period ended in October. You owe $60 on the deed. The bank is taking the land. Ruth Calloway didn't flinch. Her left shoulder moved, just slightly, a barely perceptible tremor that Wade caught only because he was watching for exactly that kind of thing. 8 years in the wilderness taught a man to read small movements, the deer that twitched its ear before it bolted, the sky that went a certain color before the temperature dropped 20 degrees. She was afraid, deeply and quietly and terribly afraid, and she refused to show it to him. I have $20, Mr. Pruitt. Her voice was steady, controlled, the voice of someone who had decided, somewhere along the way, that she was not going to give him the satisfaction of hearing it shake. I sold the last of the laying hens. I just need another month to secure the rest. Secure it how? Pruitt half turned to glance at the men lounging near the Cracker Barrel. Made sure they were watching, they were. He smiled at them before he turned back. Going to knit us some sweaters? You can't even see the yarn, the men snickered. Bo Lester, who smelled of cheap whiskey at 9 in the morning and considered it a personal achievement, let out a short bark of a laugh. It's done, Ruth. Move into the church cellar. Reverend Stanton's already set up a cot. That's where you belong now. Ruth's knuckles went white around the hickory cane. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She stood there and absorbed it the way people absorbed something they couldn't physically stop. The way you absorbed cold when you'd run out of wood. You didn't fight it. You held yourself together and waited for it to be over. That land is mine, she said quietly. Thomas and I bought it free and clear before the tax rates changed. There is good timber on that property. Timber you can't chop. Pruitt was fully enjoying himself now. I'm filing the paperwork at noon. You want to say goodbye to the deed? You'd better do it before then. Wade had been watching. He hadn't meant to watch. He had meant to collect his $85 from Gus Henley, buy his coffee and salt and powder, and get back up the mountain before the afternoon clouds moved in. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But there was something about the angle of Ruth Calloway's jaw, the way it set, the way it refused to drop, even when every other muscle in her body was quietly bracing against the force of what was being done to her. He had seen that jaw before, on men who knew they were outnumbered and fought anyway, on animals that still showed their teeth with one leg caught in a trap. He turned back to the counter. Gus Henley had finished his tally. 85 for the lot, Harlan. Already reaching for the cash box. Wade didn't reach for the money. He turned and walked across the uneven floorboards toward the flour sacks. His boots were heavy. Each step landed with a sound that made the Snickers by the Cracker Barrel go quiet, one by one, like candles getting pinched out. Pruitt straightened when the shadow fell over him, turned, looked up, and kept looking up. You're in my light, Harlan. His voice had lost the bravado he'd been using on Ruth. Gone thin, careful. Wade ignored him. Looked down at Ruth instead. $60 clears the debt. Her head turned toward the sound of his voice with the precision of someone who had spent years navigating by sound alone. Her grip on the cane tightened. Who's speaking? Wade Harlan. A pause. She was deciding something. He could see it in the stillness of her face. Yes. $60 clears the county tax and the bank's penalty fee. He turned to Pruitt. Write the receipt. Pruitt blinked. Now see here, Harlan. This is a municipal. Write the receipt, one half step forward, hands at his sides. He didn't raise them. Didn't need to. The sheer geometry of 240 pounds moving deliberately into a man's space produced its own argument. Pruitt stumbled backward and hit a shelf of canned goods. Something fell and rolled across the floor. Pruitt scrambled for his pocketbook, pulled out a ledger and a pencil, scribbled with shaking hands, tore the page out and held it forward without looking up. Wade walked back to the counter, took $60 from the stack Gus Henley had laid out, dropped it into Pruitt's outstretched hand. Not gently, the way you'd drop a stone into still water. Done, Wade said. Pruitt left fast. The bell above the door clanged like it was trying to apologize for him. The store was silent. Wade walked back to Ruth. held out the receipt, stopped. Because he was holding a piece of paper out to a woman who couldn't see it, and that was about as useful as handing a map to a river. He folded the receipt carefully, tucked it into the pocket of her shawl. "Why did you do that?" Ruth asked, steady voice, careful voice. The voice of a woman who had learned that gratitude offered too quickly to the wrong person could be turned into a chain. "I need a place to winter." He was already looking at the door. "Your land is on the river. Good timber on the ridge. I'll pay my keep in labor. I fix the roof. I chop the wood. You keep the deed. I don't need a savior, Mr. Harlan." "Good. Because I'm not one," he glanced back. "I'm just a man who hates Silas Pruitt. We have a deal or not?" She thought about it. The calculation moved across her face, plainly. A freezing church cellar and a cot that smelled of mildew against a dangerous mountain man living on her property. Against losing the last thing she'd held onto, she extended her right hand. The calluses on her palm were years of work, years of making do without anyone's help. "We have a deal," she said. By Friday, Cold Creek had manufactured a new joke. The savage and the blind woman were getting married. Not born of romance, born of logistics and a reverend with opinions so strong they had acquired the force of local law. Reverend Stanton had a face that could curdle fresh milk from 20 paces, and a theology built from equal parts scripture and suspicion. He took one look at the arrangement and produced a 10-minute sermon about moral decay that nobody had asked for. He would not, he said, allow an unmarried man and woman to share a plot of land. He would contact the sheriff. He used the word indecency 4 times. Wade didn't care about the reverend's morals. He cared about the sheriff's rifle. Ruth cared about keeping her land. So on a gray Thursday morning with the temperature sitting just above brutal, they stood in the drafty vestibule of the Methodist church and said words in front of a man who clearly found the entire proceeding a personal offense. The pews were not empty. A dozen townsfolk had arrived, not out of goodwill but out of the same impulse that drew people to watch a building burn. They sat in the back rows and whispered behind their hands. Wade stood at the front with the stillness of someone who had once spent 3 days motionless in a snowdrift, waiting for a shot, and found this only marginally more comfortable. Amos Briggs, who ran the smithy and the gun shop out of the same building, had fashioned a simple iron ring that morning for 5 cents. No engraving, no sentiment. Just a circle of iron beaten smooth. When Wade placed it on Ruth's finger, Bo Lester let out a loud contemptuous bark from 3 rows back. Wade's right hand moved, instinctively, toward the bone handle of the hunting knife at his belt. Ruth's hand closed around his wrist. Her grip was startling, like a trap, springing shut. "Let them laugh," she said quietly, her clouded eyes fixed straight ahead at the altar. "Breath is cheap, lumber is not." They left without shaking the reverend's hand. Wade loaded Ruth's few belongings into the back of a hired buckboard wagon. It didn't take long. She didn't have much. A wooden chest, some tools, a few cooking implements. The inventory of a woman who had been systematically stripped of everything soft and decorative until only the essential remained. The ride out to the property followed the river road, rutted and half-frozen. The horses picked their way through patches of ice. Wade drove. Ruth sat beside him on the wooden bench with her hands folded in her lap, straight-backed, not asking where they were. She didn't need to. She listened to the sound of the water changing as they passed through the pine break. Counted something in her head that she didn't share. She knew exactly where she was. They pulled up to the homestead. Wade set the brake and looked. The main cabin sagged under the weight of wet leaves and 3 seasons of neglect. The door hung on one rusted hinge. The chimney had shed half its mortar, and beyond the cabin, right on the edge of the riverbank, stood the skeleton. Thomas Calloway had been trying to build a grist mill before the river took him. The timber frame stood half-finished and fully rotted. The posts had gone gray. The beams had warped. The whole structure leaned slightly toward the water as if it had been trying to follow him in. "It's a mess," Wade said. "No point in softening it." "I know," Ruth said. She reached for her cane and stepped down from the wagon before he could offer a hand. Found the ground with her cane tip, tested it, stepped down with the efficiency of someone who had been navigating without assistance long enough that offered help had started to feel like an obstacle. Wade unhitched the horses and tied them off. When he turned back, Ruth was already walking not toward the cabin, toward the rotting mill frame. Her cane swept in wide rhythmic arcs through the dead grass and mud. Finding the terrain, registering it, filing it away. "Watch your step," Wade called. Moving after her, There's loose timber everywhere, nails sticking up. I know where the timber is, she said without slowing. She walked directly to the main support post and stopped. Pressed her bare right hand flat against the wood. Not gently, the way someone touches something fragile. Precisely, the way someone takes a measurement. Wade stopped a few feet away and crossed his arms. He figured she was grieving. A woman coming back to the monument of everything her husband had tried to do and failed. He decided to give her the space for it and turned his attention to the cabin. I'll patch the roof before sundown, he said. Get a fire going inside. Leave the roof, Ruth said. He stopped. You want to sleep under a leaking ceiling? The cabin is temporary shelter. She turned her head toward him. The clouded eyes found him with a directness that had nothing to do with sight. Thomas was a good man. But he didn't know construction. He laid this foundation too close to the flood line. That's why it's rotting. That's why there will be nothing left by spring. Then what's the point of? Come here, she said. Not a request. He walked over. She pulled a heavy ball of twine from the deep pocket of her wool skirt, held out the end. Take this. Walk exactly 15 paces directly away from the water. Tell me when you hit the granite outcropping. He took the end, walked. On the 15th step, his boot connected with solid rock beneath a thin layer of moss. I'm here. Tie the string to the base of the rock. Tight, he tied it. When he turned back, Ruth was already in motion. She moved quickly now, purposeful. She tied her end of the twine to the rusted iron wheel hub. Thomas has left half buried in the mud. Then she reached into her pocket again and produced another spool. Thicker cord, then a third. Then wooden stakes and a rusted mallet. Stood still. He did not chop wood, did not fix the roof, did not do anything useful. He watched for the next hour. A blind woman mapped an acre of uneven, debris-littered ground. She used different thicknesses of rope for different structural purposes. She measured by paces, by arm lengths, by the sound the river made against 3 different sections of rock that told her things about the current velocity he wouldn't have known to ask. She drove the wooden stakes into the frozen earth with the mallet, finding the crown of each stake by touch, angling each blow with the precision of someone who had done this 10,000 times in their head before doing it once with their hands. Because she had 3 years in the dark. 3 years lying in a bed that felt like a coffin, listening to Thomas's half-finished mill groan against the wind outside. 3 years of feeling the warped boards he'd cut, running her fingers over the mistakes, understanding through touch what she'd never been taught through training. 3 years of calculating, load-bearing ratios, water wheel diameter against current velocity. The exact pitch of a mill race that would maximize flow without destroying the structure in a spring flood. She'd had nothing but time and darkness and mathematics. By the time the sun dropped behind the western ridge, the ground between the ruined mill and the cabin was covered in a geometric web of intersecting ropes and string. Wade walked the perimeter of it as Ruth drove the final stake. He looked at the intersections, the angles, the way the string accounted for the granite outcropping and the slope of the ground and the distance from the water. He had built plenty of things on his own. Cabin walls, trap lines, a smokehouse up on the ridge. He knew sound construction when he saw it. This was not just sound. This was the floor plan of a large, precisely engineered building, and it was flawless. Ruth stood up from the final stake, wiped her dirty hands on her apron. She wasn't breathing hard from exertion. She was breathing hard from something else, from the sheer accumulated weight of having held something this large inside her head for 3 years and finally being allowed to put it on the ground. What is this? Wade asked. She turned toward his voice, found his face with those pale, accurate eyes. The town thinks I'm a helpless widow sitting on a pile of useless timber. Her voice had dropped its careful defensive edge. What replaced it was something he hadn't heard from anyone in a long time. Absolute certainty. They think Silas Pruitt did me a favor by waiting this long to take it. They think a blind woman and a mountain man are the punchline of a story that's already over. She walked toward him, stopped close, reached out and found his forearm. Her grip was iron. I have been designing this in the dark for 3 years, Wade Harlan. Every angle, every load, every gear ratio. I know where the water runs fast and where it eddies. I know how deep to sink the axle supports into that granite so they hold against a spring flood. I know the diameter of the drive wheel and the pitch of the mill race, and how many board feet this machine will cut in 1 working hour. She released his arm. I'm not building a shack, I'm building a sawmill, the only one within 50 miles. and you are going to help me build it." Wade looked at the web of ropes and string. He looked at it for a long time. He was a man who trusted what he could see and measure and test. He trusted tracks in snow that told him where an elk had passed 6 hours ago. He trusted the color of a sky that told him what the weather was going to do. He trusted the grain of a piece of wood that told him where it would split under an axe. He was looking at 3 years of mathematics laid out in twine on frozen ground. And it was right, every line of it. "All right, Mrs. Calloway." He rolled up his sleeves. The cold hit his forearms and he ignored it, which was something he'd had a great deal of practice doing. "Where do we start?" The axe became the heartbeat of the valley. It started before dawn, while the frost was still white and thick on the dead grass. And it did not stop until the moon was high enough to cast hard shadows on the snow. Wade swung a double-bitted felling axe with the efficiency of years of learned mechanics. He didn't hack at the trees. He read the grain. He found the weakness in the wood the way you found the weakness in any opponent, and then he put the steel exactly there. Every tree that fell shook the frozen earth. Every crack echoed down into Cold Creek. The town heard it. People stood on the boardwalk outside Gus Henley's with their hands in their pockets and their breath making clouds in the cold air, and they listened to the distant, rhythmic percussion. At first, they smiled, because they figured a mountain man chopping wood meant firewood, meant a crude lean to getting built so the blind woman wouldn't freeze before she gave up and moved into the church cellar where she belonged. They figured 2 weeks before that axe went quiet, and the story ended the way they'd predicted. The axe did not go quiet. By the 3rd week, the timbers Wade was hauling down to the riverbank on the draft horses told a different story. Not firewood lengths. Structural timbers, long and straight, stripped of branches and floated down to the building site, the pile growing into something that had a deliberate shape. Up at the homestead, Ruth worked beside him, not in the cabin, not by the fire. Out in the freezing mud, beside the heavy sawhorses she'd had him set up on her 2nd day on the property. He would guide a stripped log onto the horses, and Ruth would come to it. She ran her bare hands over the rough bark from one end to the other before she touched a tool, feeling for knots, for hidden rot, for the natural curve of the wood that would tell her how it would behave under stress. Then she picked up the drawknife, a heavy 2-handled tool with a long curved blade. She worked it toward her body in long controlled strokes, the bark peeling away in ribbons. She knew exactly how deep to cut by the resistance of the blade and the sound the steel made against different densities of wood. She never cut too deep. She never cut too shallow. When a timber needed to be squared for a joint, Wade used a broad axe along the lines she scored into the wood with a heavy nail. She scored them by feel. The first time he checked her markings with a straight edge, they were within a 1/16 of an inch across 8 feet of uneven timber. He didn't say anything about that. They spoke very little. Words cost breath. Breath was warmth. They developed instead the wordless choreography of 2 people who were good at different things and had figured out how those things fit together. Wade learned to wait. Ruth learned his rhythms. When he was setting a mortise joint, she would come to it without being called, kneel in the mud, and slide her fingers inside the carved pocket to measure depth and angle by touch. 1/4 inch too shallow on the south side. She pulled her hand back. Her knuckles were raw from the cold. She didn't look at them. The tenon will fail under roof load if it doesn't seat flush. He picked up his chisel, shaved exactly a 1/4 inch, stepped back. She checked it again. A single nod. Good. She never said great. She never said perfect. She said good when something met her standard, which was high, and said nothing at all when it exceeded it, which happened rarely. He found himself working toward the silence that meant exceptional, more than he'd worked toward anything in a long time. That surprised him. It irritated him slightly, which was how he knew it was probably true. By the 3rd week of November, the skeleton of the new sawmill had begun to rise from the riverbank. Not the rotting, haphazard frame Thomas had attempted. This was different. The primary support columns were 2 feet in diameter, sunk into the granite outcropping at the angles Ruth had calculated on her rope grid. The mortise and tenon joints were locked together with massive oak pegs that Ruth carved by firelight in the evenings, her hands moving over the wood with the fluency of something that no longer required thought. The town's curiosity was becoming something less comfortable than curiosity. Clay Aldrich rode up the wagon trail on a Tuesday afternoon. Clay was the kind of young man whose principal qualification for his opinions was that his father owned the livery stable, which in Cold Creek passed for authority. He sat his roan gelding at the edge of the property and stared at the structure going up. It was already larger than anything he'd expected. He urged the horse closer. Wade was 50 feet off the ground, straddling a crossbeam, driving an oak peg through a joint with a wooden maul. Ruth was on the ground below, operating the block and tackle system Wade had rigged for hoisting the heavy timbers. She kept both hands on the rope. Clay looked at the structure. At the scale of it, at the engineering of it, his jaw came loose. "What in the hell are you building?" he called up. Wade didn't stop swinging the maul, didn't look down. Ruth turned her head toward Clay's voice. Her grip on the rope stayed firm. "A business, Mr. Aldrich." Clay collected his arrogance. "The bank owns this land in 3 weeks, Ruth. You're building a barn for Silas Pruitt. The taxes are paid, taxes maybe." His voice carried the satisfaction of someone delivering bad news they'd been looking forward to delivering. "But Pruitt says your husband took a private loan against the deed before he drowned. $80 due December 1st. Didn't mention it at the store. Figured a blind woman couldn't read a contract anyway." The maul stopped. The silence that dropped into that space was a different kind of silence. Not the quiet Wade usually kept. This was weather, the kind that came before something serious. Wade looked down at Clay from 50 feet up with eyes that had gone flat and dark. Clay's horse shifted under him. "Horses knew things, you tell Silas Pruitt." Wade's voice came down off that beam like something that had weight and edges. Low, even, each word placed separately, that if he sets foot on this claim before December 1st, I will nail his boots to the courthouse floor while he's still wearing them. Clay swallowed hard. The arrogance had completely left his face, replaced by something younger and considerably less certain. He yanked the reins left and spurred his horse back down the trail. Wade climbed down. When he came around the corner, Ruth had let go of the rope. Her shoulders had dropped, not much, but enough, is it true? He asked. She set the rope end down carefully. Thomas signed a lot of papers in the last year. He was afraid. Pruitt would have kept a private loan quiet just for the pleasure of pulling it out at the right moment. Her voice had gone thin. Not broken, but thin. $80. He looked out at the river. He'd spent his trapping money on the tax payment and on the iron fittings for the mill, the lag bolts, the carriage hardware, the saw blade ordered from the supplier in Denver, $4 in a tin can under the cabin floorboards. "I'll pack my things," Ruth whispered. The defeat finally fractured her voice. "You've worked hard, Wade. Take the horses, take the tools. Leave me here." He looked at the mill, at the support columns sunk into granite, at the crossbeams she'd designed to carry a load that most professional builders wouldn't have attempted, at everything they had built in the freezing dark over the past weeks. He looked at $80 of work, at 3 years of darkness turned into something that was against every expectation anyone in this valley had ever had standing up. "We need a main axle for the water wheel," he said. He picked up his broadaxe, oak, old growth, 3 miles up the east ridge. "We cut it tomorrow." Ruth lifted her eyes toward him. "Did you hear what I said? We have no money. Pruitt will take everything. Let him try, Wade. Grab the other end of this rope." He turned back toward the scaffold. "Sun is dropping." She'd stood there for a moment, just a moment, then she picked up the rope. He left the cabin at 2 in the morning, 2 hours before the grudging kind of dawn that Cold Creek produced in November. The temperature had dropped overnight into the kind of cold that didn't announce itself. It just arrived and started getting into everything. He didn't take the horses. He walked over his right shoulder. He carried the Hawken rifle, a 50-inch octagonal barrel forged in St. Louis. Curly maple stock worn smooth as riverstone by 8 years of daily handling. Double-set triggers he'd adjusted himself to break clean and precise. He had built his life around this rifle, not as a symbol, as a working reality. It had dropped a charging grizzly in the mountains east of the valley at 40 yards when he'd had 1 shot and 1 chance. It had put meat on the line through 3 consecutive winters when trapping failed. It was a working tool that happened to be worth $150 to the right buyer. He walked into Cold Creek as the sun cleared the eastern ridge. He went to the smithy. Amos Briggs was already at his forge. He looked up when Wade filled the doorway. His eyes went to the Hawken before they went anywhere else, Harlan. "Early for you." Wade walked to the workbench and set the rifle down, gently. The barrel rang softly against the wood. Briggs crossed to it. stood and looked at it with the attention of a man who understood its value. Then he ran one thumb across the brass patch box. That, Briggs said quietly, is a beautiful piece of work. $80, Wade said. Gold or good banknotes? Briggs looked up. He knew the rifle was worth substantially more. He also knew that Wade Harlan didn't sell his primary weapon unless the alternative was worse than being unarmed in the Wyoming wilderness. I can do 60. He tapped the stock. Hard winter. Cash is tight. Wade put his hand on the barrel. 80. Or I take it to the assayer in Denver come spring. Briggs held his gaze for a moment, exhaled, went to the iron strongbox under the counter, unlocked it with the key he wore around his neck, and counted out 4 $20 gold pieces. Wade picked up the coins. He did not look at the rifle again. He walked out into the cold street. The bank didn't open until 8. Wade stood on the boardwalk across from it and waited, still, not shifting his weight, not adjusting against the cold. People moved around him, giving him a wide berth. Several of them looked at the empty rifle sling still strapped across his chest. Nobody asked. At 8 o'clock, Silas Pruitt came down the main street in his beaver fur coat and his bowler hat. He unlocked the bank, stepped inside, left the door open to air out the vault smell. Wade followed him in. Pruitt was settling into his chair behind the mahogany desk when the footfalls made him look up. The easy morning satisfaction drained off his face. Harlan. The bank isn't open for. Wade stepped up to the desk, reached into his coat pocket, set 4 gold eagles on the mahogany one at a time. Each one landed with a sound like a small verdict. $80. Write the receipt, Wade said. Mark the private loan paid in full. Pruitt stared at the coins. He was looking for the trick. He took longer than he should have. This doesn't change anything, he said finally, picking up a pen. The bitterness had replaced the smug authority in his voice. She can't run a mill blind. You're both delaying the… Write it. Pruitt wrote it, stamped it, shoved it across the desk. Wade took the paper, folded it twice, put it in his coat, walked out without another word. When he returned to the property, the sun was high and weak. Ruth was outside by the fire pit, a blanket around her shoulders, her hands resting in her lap. She turned her head when she heard his boots on the frozen ground. You're back, she said quietly. Debt is cleared. He walked to her, pressed the folded paper into her hand. Pruitt won't bother you again. She held the paper, ran her thumb across its fold, her brow furrowed. She was listening to something he hadn't yet noticed he was doing. When you walk, she said, the brass fittings on your rifle sling rattle. I've learned the sound of it. It's how I know it's you coming up from 50 yards out in the dark. He didn't say anything. I don't hear them, Wade. He looked at the mill frame, at the axle cradles they'd chiseled into the riverbank, at the work that was still ahead. He felt the absence of the weight on his shoulder, the way you felt the absence of something that had been part of your body long enough to seem like part of you. Ruth stood. She walked toward him until her boots touched his, reached up with her hands and found his shoulder, found the empty leather sling, let her hands drop. Her pale eyes locked onto his face with the accuracy that still, after weeks, caught him off guard. You sold your life insurance for a blind woman's rotting lumber, she said. Her voice had come undone from its careful structure. Just slightly, just enough to let something reel through. I bought a partner. He stepped past her, picked up the broadaxe from the tool stack. We have a water wheel to build. Daylight is burning. She stood there for a moment, and then, for the first time since he'd put $60 on a mercantile counter for a woman he'd never spoken to, Wade Harlan heard Ruth Calloway laugh. It was a short sound, controlled, as if she hadn't quite meant to let it out, but it was real, and it was warm, and it stayed with him all the way up the East Ridge, where the old-growth oak waited, and the cold was honest and the work ahead was enormous. For the first time in 8 years, that felt exactly right. The cold that came in late November was not the cold of October. October cold was a warning, a sharp word from a stranger, unpleasant but survivable, ignorable. If you were moving fast enough and working hard enough and had enough wood split and stacked to feel like you were ahead of it. November cold in the Wyoming high country was something else entirely. It moved in like a predator that had already decided the outcome and was simply taking its time. It didn't just freeze the mud, it pulled the moisture straight out of the air until every breath felt like swallowing ground glass. It got into the iron fittings on the mill frame and contracted the metal a quarter inch overnight. It got into the green wood and made it brittle in ways that could cost you the whole structure if you weren't reading it right. It got into your hands and slowed them down, made fingers that should have been nimble turn clumsy and slow. Wade had wintered in the Wyoming high country 8 times. He knew what this cold wanted. It wanted the mill. It was not going to get it. The oak tree was 3 miles up the east ridge. Not a tree, exactly. A monument. Hundreds of years old, rooted into the mountain like it had been placed there on purpose and had spent the intervening centuries making itself permanent. The trunk was 4 feet across at the base. The root system had pushed boulders aside over the course of a century, rearranged the topography of that specific patch of ridge in a way that suggested the tree had opinions about its surroundings and the means to act on them. Felling it took 2 full days, 2 days of alternating between the crosscut saw and the axe, working the notch on the downhill side, reading the lean of the trunk against the sky, planning the fall so it didn't take the scaffold rigging with it on the way down. Wade worked in silence. Ruth sat on a low rock at the edge of the tree line, wrapped in the heavy buffalo robe he'd dragged up from the cabin, and listened. She was not resting. She was building a map in her head of the sounds the tree made as the cut deepened, the frequency of the creak changing as the wood fibers gave way, the specific note of the final split before the trunk began to move. She had not told him she was doing this. He figured it out on the second afternoon when she said, without being asked, another 2 hours on the south face before she tips, and she was off by 11 minutes. He didn't say anything about that, because some things you just added to the account you were quietly keeping of a person. The account that told you who they actually were underneath the things they let you see. Stripping the felled oak and getting it down to the river took 3 more days, 5 days total for 1 piece of wood. The draft horses strained in their traces, hooves finding purchase on frozen ground that kept trying to betray them, breath coming out in great rolling clouds as they dragged the massive log down the switchback trail. Wade guided them from the front, watching the slope, calling course corrections. Ruth walked beside the log for part of the descent, one hand resting lightly on the bark, feeling the vibration of the shifting load, just feeling it, tracking it, filing it away. She always needed the information later. By the time they wrestled the oak log into position on the riverbank, it was the last day of November. The Laramie River had begun to ice at the edges. The black water churned hard through the center channel, cold and fast and indifferent to anything above it. The main axle had to be set today. The whole mill waited on this one piece. The water wheel couldn't go up without an axle to turn on. The gears couldn't mesh. The saw blade couldn't spin. The carriage sled had no purpose. The entire structure they had built over the past weeks was until this log was set into its stone cradles on either bank. Just an expensive and well-engineered pile of timber. The axle had to be suspended perfectly horizontal across the water. Resting in the carved granite cradles, Wade had spent 4 days chiseling into the riverbank on both sides, working in the current up to his thighs in water that made his legs go numb inside of 10 minutes. The cradles were deep, curved to fit the diameter of the log, angled to account for the weight load when the wheel began to pull. The log weighed just over 1,000 pounds. Wade had built a sheer legs derrick for the lift. 2 massive poles, each one 30 feet long, lashed together at the top and braced apart at the base, leaning out over the water at the precise angle that would put the apex of the rig directly above the center point of the axle's intended resting place. A heavy iron ring at the top. The block and tackle running through it, triple sheaved, because even with mechanical advantage 1,000 pounds of oak was still 1,000 pounds. It was the best rig he could build with what he had. He was aware of its limitations. Ruth stood back from the muddy bank, both hands wrapped around the tail rope of the hoist. She had positioned herself at the top of the gentle slope behind the derrick, boots dug into the frozen dirt at the edge of the grass. The angle gave her the best leverage. She had worked this out before he explained it, which he had also noticed and filed away without comment. Tension, Wade called. He was already in the water. There was no way around it. Someone had to be in the river to guide the log into the cradles. The current would push the suspended timber downstream the moment the weight came off the ground. It had to be corrected for in real time, by hand, by someone strong enough to push 1,000 pounds of oak against the force of the Laramie in late November. Wade went in. The cold hit him like a door slamming shut. His buckskins soaked through in the first step, and then the water was at his waist, and his body registered this as an emergency, And then his body was informed that they didn't have time for emergencies, and it was going to have to manage. He planted his boots on the river bottom, feeling for solid stone beneath the gravel, and braced. Behind him he heard the rig begin to work. Ruth leaned back, threw her full weight against the rope. The pulleys screamed in their iron housings. The tail rope bit into her leather work gloves. Slowly, agonizingly, the oak axle lifted. First an inch off the mud, then 6, then a foot. Wade positioned himself under the suspended timber, back against the current, hands braced against the log's side. He could feel the vibration of the weight through his palms, feel the rope system straining overhead, the derrick poles creaking against their lashing. Lower, he called. 2 inches. Ruth let the rope slip exactly 2 inches. She knew 2 inches. Somehow, in her hands and in the learned mechanics of her body, she understood the difference between 2 inches and 3 inches of rope slip under a 1,000-pound load, which was the kind of precision that should have taken years of supervised training to acquire. Except she had spent 3 years learning things in the dark. The axle descended, 6 inches above the cradle on the near bank. 5, 4, and then the lashing rope at the apex of the derrick made a sound, a small sound. Dry and crisp and wrong, like a knuckle popping in cold weather. One of the thick hemp ropes, holding the derrick poles together at the top, parted under the combined assault of cold and load. The structure didn't collapse. Not entirely. But it lurched hard to the right, the poles grinding against each other, the iron ring at the top jumping 3 inches sideways in a single heartbeat, and the oak axle swung. It swung right. Fast and heavy and without mercy, the way 1,000 pounds of suspended oak moved when it came loose from its intended path. It caught Wade across the chest like a hammer the size of a tree. The breath left his body all at once. The impact threw him backward off his feet. And then there was no ground, just the water. Cold and black, and hitting him from every direction simultaneously, turning the world over, dragging him over the rocks on the river bottom with a sound he distantly recognized as his own body being moved against its will. His lungs had stopped, not from fear. The cold had seized them, reached in and clamped them shut with both hands. He fought upward toward where the light was, which was not much light because the sun had gone behind the ridge, but it was something. His hand broke the surface, hit the edge of the ice shelf. Found air, he gasped, one breath. Ragged and tearing and cold enough to burn the whole way down, he could hear Ruth calling his name, which meant the rope was still taut, which meant she hadn't let go. He grabbed for the log. His hands found bark, rough and solid, and above him. He pulled his head above the water and looked up. The axle was still suspended, canted wrong, but still up, and on the bank behind him. Ruth Calloway was on her knees in the frozen mud, both hands wrapped around the tail rope so many times it had gone up to her wrists and partway to her elbows. Her boots were buried in the earth. Her whole body was a single rigid line of resistance. Leaning back against a load that should have required 3 men to hold, her gloves were in shreds, red showed through the gaps. She had not let go, not 1 inch. He heard her voice through the roar of the water, not screaming anymore, lower, harder. A sound he had never heard from her before. Get up, Wade. Right now he got up, not fast, not gracefully. He hooked his arm over the suspended log and let it take his weight, and dragged himself along its length toward the near bank where the stone cradle waited. The current fought him every inch. The derrick groaned overhead, the damaged lashing holding by whatever loyalty remained in the fibers. He reached the cradle, got his shoulder under the end of the log. Found his footing on the river bottom, which was treacherous and covered in rocks that wanted to roll under his boots. Took 3 attempts to find something solid enough to push from. Drop it, he called. His voice came out wrong, waterlogged, barely audible over the river, but she heard it. Ruth let the rope go. The 1,000-pound oak axle dropped into the granite cradle with a sound like a cannon going off. The impact sent a shock wave through the stone bank that Wade felt in his knees. Water and ice exploded upward in a curtain. The iron ring at the apex of the derrick gave up entirely. The lashing let go. Both poles fell sideways into the river in a tangle of rope and splashing and went downstream with the current. Wade dragged himself up the bank. He collapsed on his back in the frozen mud, soaking buckskins already beginning to stiffen in the cold air, chest heaving like a bellows someone had stepped on, eyes open to the gray sky overhead. The axle was seated. He could tell from where he was lying, could see the line of it between the 2 stone cradles. Level, solid. exactly where it needed to be. Ruth was beside him. He heard her before he felt her. Her boots on the frozen mud, fast and uneven. Then her hands on his chest, pressing, feeling for the wrong kind of stillness. I'm whole. He got the words out on the third attempt. His jaw was locked from the cold, which made speaking feel like a mechanical problem. Ruth, I'm whole. Her hands went still on his chest. She was kneeling beside him in the mud. Her hair had come loose from its pins. Her breathing came in short, hard bursts that were almost sobs but weren't quite. Because Ruth Calloway was not a woman who let herself sob, but she was a woman who had just held a 1,000-pound load on raw rope while the man she had made a business arrangement with was drowning underneath it. He sat up. Several things expressed opinions about that. He took her hands. The leather gloves were destroyed. Sliced through at the rope line, peeled back from the palms. He turned her hands over carefully. The damage ran across both palms in deep, raw channels. The cold had already done something to the color of the skin around the wounds. He stood. Which was harder than it sounds when your core temperature was somewhere in the vicinity of hypothermia, and every joint had decided to file a formal complaint. He picked her up, both arms. She made a sound of surprise and then went quiet, which was its own kind of surprise. He carried her to the cabin, kicked the door shut behind him with his boot, set her on the bed. The fire had burned down to coals. He built it back up fast, using the instinct of someone who had made fire in bad conditions. So many times it required no conscious thought. Then he dealt with his own wet clothing before his body stopped cooperating, which it was threatening to do, wrapping himself in the heavy wool blanket from the chest at the foot of the bed. The whiskey was on the shelf by the window. He poured a measure over a clean rag, turned to her. This is going to burn. I know what whiskey does, Wade. Your hands out. She extended them, palms up, steady, not a tremor in either one. He pressed the rag into the damage. She hissed, a sharp intake through clenched teeth. Her jaw set hard. Her eyes went somewhere else entirely, but her hands did not move. He cleaned both palms, wrapped them in strips of linen he kept for exactly this kind of situation. Because 8 years in the wilderness meant you kept bandaging material and kept it clean. His hands working on hers required a deliberate carefulness that was a different language than the one he normally used his hands for. She watched him do it, with her clouded eyes, the ones that could not see and somehow looked anyway. The fire caught and climbed and began to mean something against the cold pressing in from all sides. Outside, the wind made its usual complaints about the roof. You saved my life, he said. Not a thank you. Not gratitude dressed up in words. A statement of fact, placed between them like a receipt for a transaction. He was a man who dealt in what was true, and what was true was that without the rope holding that axle off the river bottom, he would have been held under the timber in the current, and that would have been the end of everything. Ruth was quiet for a moment. Looking at the fire, you are the only person in this valley, she said slowly, who has treated me like I'm not broken. Still at the fire. Not at him, my husband drowned in that river. A pause. I wasn't going to let it have you too. He looked at her, not the way he looked at terrain or weather or tracks in snow. The way you looked at something you had stopped thinking of as belonging to a category separate from yourself. He looked at the precise angle of her jaw and the exhaustion cut into the skin around her sightless eyes, and the hands he had just wrapped in clean linen. And he was aware that something had shifted, not dramatically. Not the way things shifted in stories. Quietly. Like a river changing course underground, where you couldn't see it yet. But the water was already going somewhere different than it had been. He didn't have a word for it, so he pulled the quilt up over her shoulders. Sleep. We have an axle mounted properly and a water wheel to build. The cradle on the south side needs another inch of clearance, she said, already settling back against the pillow. I could tell from the sound of the impact. I'll fix it in the morning. I know you will, she said, and closed her eyes. He sat in the chair by the fire until she was asleep. Then he sat there a while longer. The water wheel took 2 more weeks. Ruth's hands were bandaged, which meant she couldn't grip a tool. Which meant, for the first time since they'd started building, she couldn't do the physical work. But her hands were never what made her formidable. It was the architecture inside her head, the 3 years of mathematics that didn't require fingers to exist. She sat bundled in the buffalo robe at the edge of the frozen bank and directed every swing of Wade's hammer, every angle of the spoke shaping, every measurement of the paddle boards that would catch the river's force and convert it into rotational energy. She had memorized every component dimension weeks before. She held the complete system in her head the way some people held a piece of music. Every part relative to every other part, every tolerance, every margin. Which was very small. The water wheel was an undershot design. Ruth's decision made years before Wade had any involvement in it, not a common choice. Most mills used an overshot wheel, which dropped water from a raised flume onto the top of the wheel and used gravity. An overshot wheel was more efficient in theory, but it required a significant elevation drop, and the Laramie in this section ran fast and flat. The river doesn't drop here, she had said weeks earlier when they were still in the rope grid phase. It runs, hard and horizontal. We use the force of the current, not a vertical fall. The paddles have to be angled at exactly 17 degrees to the plane of the wheel. Not 15, not 18. 17, you calculated that, in the dark. For 3 years a pause. I had considerable time. He had not said anything to that. Because what could you say to that? He shaped the paddles now. 24 of them, each one angled precisely in its notch on the circular rim. Ruth checked each one by running her fingertips along the edge where the paddle met the rim, feeling for the geometry she couldn't see. That one's off. She pulled her hand back. Half a degree forward, he adjusted it. Now, she checked again. Good. 24 times they did this. 24 checks. 23 corrections. Because the first one happened to be right, and neither of them mentioned it. The cold had gone from enemy to something closer to a shared condition. They both spoke it now, moved through it, dressed against it, and worked through it, and had stopped fighting it long enough to use it. The way you used difficult country. You didn't fight the mountain. You read it. You went where it let you go. Cold Creek had stopped smiling. By the time November turned to December and the mill frame was fully enclosed, and the wheel was taking shape on its oak axle, the people who had placed their comfortable bet on failure were running out of comfortable explanations. They had said the structure would collapse. It didn't. They had said the blind woman would lose the land. She hadn't. They had said a mountain man with no rifle and a $4 stake couldn't build anything worth worrying about. The thing on the riverbank was worth worrying about. It was 2 stories tall, timber framed and solid, the joints pegged with oak. The wheel hung above the river current, paddles waiting. The mill race, the channel that would direct the water at those paddles, was cut and lined with stone. The interior held the gear mechanism Ruth had spent 3 years designing. The main drive gear connected to a secondary shaft, connected to the carriage sled and the circular saw blade that had arrived from the Denver supplier 2 weeks prior in a crate that Wade had carried up from Cold Creek on his own back because he did not trust the delivery wagon on the iced road. The blade was a serious piece of American steelwork, 24 inches in diameter, tooth-set ground to a precise angle for cutting green timber. It had cost him the last of his trapping money, spent before he had ever set eyes on Ruth Calloway's rope grid. He had not mentioned this. She already knew. She had not mentioned that she knew. This was how they operated. A language of acknowledged things that neither person verbalized. A ledger kept in parallel and balanced without discussion. It was the most straightforward arrangement Wade Harlan had ever had with another person, which he had been sitting with for several weeks now, and which he had not resolved. It was on a moonless Thursday in mid-December that the resentment of Cold Creek arrived at their door with a lantern and a can of coal oil. Wade had been asleep on the floor by the hearth. He didn't sleep in the bed. The bed was Ruth's. This had been established without discussion on the first night, the same way most things between them were established, by one person doing the obvious thing and the other allowing it. He slept on a bedroll near the fire, and he slept the way he had always slept in the wilderness. Light, with one layer of consciousness left running like a low-banked fire, monitoring the sounds that belonged to the night and waiting for one that didn't. The twig snapped at around midnight. He knew it was midnight because the fire had burned down by exactly the amount it burned down in 4 hours, which was how long he'd been asleep. He didn't move. He listened. Another sound followed. Not the wind. The wind in Wyoming had a consistent personality, and this was not it. This was the muffled sound of boots on frozen ground making a deliberate effort not to be boots on frozen ground. Near the mill, his hand found the hunting knife under the blanket. He rose without sound, went out the back door and let the dark swallow him whole. There were 3 of them, down by the riverbank, grouped around the main axle, holding a lantern shuttered to a thin slit of yellow that cast barely enough light to work by. One had a sledgehammer, one had the coal oil can. The third was Bo Lester, and Bo Lester had his mouth open, which was a permanent condition when he'd been drinking, which was most conditions. Just the main gear teeth, Bo was whispering. The whiskey was loud in his voice, even at a whisper. Smash those first, then soak the support beams. Quick fire and Pruitt takes the land for salvage value before Christmas. Shut your mouth and hold the light, the one with the sledgehammer said. He raised the hammer. He never finished the swing. Wade came out of the dark the way the dark itself moves when something that belongs there decides to stop waiting. He caught the sledgehammer mid-swing with his left hand, stopped it completely. As if the hammer had hit a wall made of something denser than wood, the man holding it looked up, looking up at Wade Harlan in the dark, when you were holding a sledgehammer and a bad plan, was, as it turned out, a memorable experience. Wade drove the heel of his right hand into the man's temple with exactly the force required. The man folded and dropped into the mud without a word. Bo Lester stumbled backward. The lantern fell. The glass broke. The oil caught for a second in the snow and then died. Bo grabbed for the revolver in his coat, which revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he was currently in. Wade crossed the distance in one stride. He took Bo by the collar, lifted him off the ground and set him against the oak axle with enough force to drive the air from his lungs. Bo's hands went to Wade's wrists and accomplished nothing at all. Listen to me, Wade said. Queer. Even. The voice he used for things that were not open to discussion. Bo listened. You are going to tell Silas Pruitt. Wade's face was close enough that Bo had no choice but to look at it directly. That if one spark touches this wood, if one gear tooth is damaged, if one board in this structure is moved from where it sits, I will come down to Cold Creek. I will not bring a knife. I will use my hands on his throat. You understand what I'm telling you? Bo nodded, frantically, repeatedly. Say it back. I'll tell him. Bo's voice was barely functional. I'll tell him exactly what you said. Every word. Wade set him down. Bo grabbed his unconscious friend by the collar and dragged him backward into the dark, tripping twice, making a sound like a man who had genuinely reconsidered the entire direction of his life in the span of about 40 seconds. The third man had already been gone since the moment Wade's hand stopped the sledgehammer. He had made a swift and sensible decision and acted on it. Wade stood in the dark by the mill and listened until the sounds of their retreat were gone. Then he stood there longer, because the axle was still there, the wheel was still there, the gear mechanism and the drive shaft and the carriage sled and the saw blade were all still there, undamaged, exactly as they had been. And in the cabin behind him, Ruth Calloway was still asleep. Some things were worth standing in the cold for. He had not always known that. He was beginning to remember it. 2 days later they fired the mill. No ceremony. No gathering of witnesses. Just the two of them on a grey morning, the river loud and cold on the other side of the sluice gate, the wheel hanging motionless above the current. Ruth stood inside the mill house beside the main drive gear. Her hands had healed enough to remove the bandages. The skin across both palms was scarred in parallel ridges, red and new, the rope's permanent signature written into her. She touched the face of the drive gear lightly, feeling the teeth, the spacing, making one final check against the calculation she had been carrying for 3 years. It matched. Of course it matched. Ready? Wade called from outside. Open the gate. He jammed the iron pry bar under the locking wedge, threw his full weight against it. The wood shrieked in protest. The wedge jumped free. The sluice gate dropped. The river came through the mill race like something that had been waiting for exactly this. The water hit the paddles of the wheel with a force that sent a shudder through the entire structure, through the stone foundation and the timber frame and the oak axle and the stone bank and the frozen ground under Wade's boots. The whole world of their work vibrated, and then nothing, 3 seconds of nothing, which was an extremely long time when you were waiting for 1,000 pounds of machinery to decide which way it was going to go. The frozen grease in the axle bearings, the sheer mass of the gear system, all of it resisting, the river pushing, the machinery pushing back. Then the oak axle let out a sound like a cannon shot. Ruth stepped back from the drive gear, both hands raised, and the gear jumped and moved, slowly at first. The reluctant, grinding movement of something massive being asked to change from stillness to motion. But the Laramie River was not asking. The Laramie River was persistent and cold, and had been running this direction for longer than anyone in Wyoming territory could account for. The river won, the wheel began to turn. Slow, then less slow. The paddles catching the current at their 17-degree angle. 3 years of dark mathematics paying out in real time, the rotational force building as the wheel found its rhythm. Inside the mill house, the drive gear caught the secondary shaft. The secondary shaft reached the carriage sled. The carriage sled lurched forward along its iron tracks, and the saw blade, 24 inches of American steel, began to spin. It came up to speed in stages. The sound rose with it. First a low complaint, then something that stopped being a complaint and became a voice. The high, fierce, sustained singing of steel moving at operational speed through air, a sound that went past noise and became presence. Wade walked inside. He stood and watched the blade. He had built things before. A cabin, a smokehouse, seasons of trap lines complex enough to count as engineering. He had built things that worked and things that almost worked, and 2 things that failed in ways that taught him what failure could teach. He had never built anything that sang. Ruth was standing in the center of the noise. The sound was total, absolute. It wrapped around her and isolated her in a world of pure vibration, which for Ruth Calloway was not isolation at all. It was information. The frequency of the axle bearing, the resonance of each timber in the frame, the specific harmonic of the drive gear mesh that told her whether the tooth engagement was within tolerance. She was reading every note of it. She extended her right hand and placed her palm flat against the oak wall. The vibration came through the wood and into the ridged scar tissue of her palm. The entire mechanical truth of the thing she had designed in the dark, traveling through solid timber to reach her, and Ruth Calloway smiled, not the short, controlled sound she'd let out in November when he paid off the second debt. Not the small, almost involuntary thing that surprised both of them when it happened. This was a real smile. Slow and wide and breaking across her face like something that had been held behind a door for 3 years and had finally been given permission to come through. Wade looked at it. He was aware, in a way that felt permanent, that he would remember that smile for the rest of his life. "Load a log on the carriage, Mr. Harlan," Ruth called over the roar. Her voice was full of something he had no name for but recognized without one. "We have timber to cut." He loaded a 12-foot length of lodgepole pine onto the carriage sled. Set the stop pins. Engage the feed mechanism. The blade touched the wood. Sawdust exploded into the air in a thick, fragrant cloud that smelled like fresh timber and possibility, and work that was actually going somewhere. The blade went through the log with a speed and cleanness that was frankly remarkable. It did not struggle. It did not wander. It cut a perfectly straight line across 12 feet of green timber and deposited a rough sawn board on the exit rollers with the casual certainty of something that had been designed exactly right for exactly this purpose. Wade locked the carriage, walked to the exit end, picked up the board, ran his thumb along the cut face. Then the edge. Ruth appeared beside him, found the board by touch, ran her own fingers along the surface, down the cut edge. "Across the end grain, 1/4-inch tolerance," she said. "Maybe a bit better. Better than the steam mill in Laramie," he said. She turned toward him. "How many cuts can we get before the light goes?" "Sun gives us 5 hours today. Then stop talking about the light and feed the next log." He fed the next log, and the one after that, and the one after that. The stack of finished lumber grew beside the mill as the afternoon shortened and the cold came back down from the ridge. The boards went onto the pile in rows, straight and true and identical, the geometry of Ruth's calculations made solid and real and sellable. 3 days later, a blizzard took out the rear roof of Gus Henley's mercantile. The weight of accumulated ice snapped the old joists, leaving half of Henley's dry goods exposed to the elements and costing him more in one night than a full summer of price haggling could recover. Wade was splitting cordwood when Henley rode up on a sway-backed mule. The maul rose and fell in its rhythmic, reliable arc, splitting thick rounds of oak with the mechanical patience of something that would keep going indefinitely. Henley reined in from a comfortable distance. "Harlan," he cleared his throat, "I need timber. 20 heavy joists, 100 feet of planking." "How much, Wade?" "Set them all against the chopping block." "Don't sell the lumber," he pointed toward the mill doors. "Talk to the boss." Henley followed the direction of his finger. Ruth was sitting on a freshly cut stump outside the mill, weaving a new length of hemp rope from raw fiber. Her scarred hands moved over the work automatically. the braid forming between her fingers while her attention was directed entirely at the sound of the mule's hooves and the particular quality of silence that meant someone was standing in front of her wanting something. Ruth? Henley tried to make it sound neighborly. Terrible weather. The roof caved. I'm in a bad spot, I heard the crack from here, she said, without stopping the weaving. Sorry about your flour sacks, Gus. I need lumber. I know you've been cutting. Fair market, 3 cents a board foot. Ruth set the rope end down. She tilted her head slightly the way she did when she'd already decided something and was selecting how to present it. 6 cents, she said. Henley made a sound low in his throat. 6. That's robbery. Steam mill in Laramie charges 4. Then ride to Laramie, 50 miles through a blizzard. Buy your 4-cent lumber. She picked the rope back up. Or if you want the wood today, it's 6 cents a foot. Plus a $10 delivery charge, because Wade has to hitch the horses in a foot of snow, and that's worth something even if you've decided it isn't. Henley's face cycled through several expressions. He stopped. Started again. That's extortion, that's commerce, Gus. Her voice was entirely pleasant. The pleasantness of someone who held every card and knew it. Henley looked at Wade, who was leaning against the woodpile, with his arms crossed and his expression that of a man who was going to be absolutely no help whatsoever. Henley thought about the coffee and the sugar and the flour getting wetter by the hour. He thought about the next blizzard that the sky had been promising since yesterday morning. Fine, he expelled the word. Fine, bank draft by noon. No drafts, Ruth said. Gold or silver? I don't trust Pruitt's paper. Henley nearly came off the mule. Now see here. And Gus, she still hadn't looked up from the weaving. The wool coat in your window display. The heavy one with the beaver fur collar. Throw that in with the delivery and Wade leaves in 10 minutes. Otherwise, we negotiate delivery timing next, and I have a long afternoon. Henley stared at the blind woman sitting on a stump in the December cold, calmly braiding rope and dictating terms to him like she was concluding a board meeting. He rode back down the trail with his mule and his pride and his urgent lumber problem. And he came back 40 minutes later with silver coin and the wool coat with the beaver fur collar folded over the saddle, and he did not attempt to renegotiate a single term. Wade watched the whole transaction from the woodpile. When Henley was gone, and the delivery wagon was loaded, and the silver was counted, and sitting in the tin box, Ruth kept bolted to the floor under the counting table, Wade came to stand beside where she'd returned to a stump. He looked down at her. 6 cents, he said. She picked up the rope she'd set aside. He'd have paid 8. But I didn't want to seem greedy. Wade Harlan laughed. It came out of him unexpected, from somewhere that had been shut for a long time and had apparently decided, without consulting him, that it was time to open again. A low, rough sound that startled the horses in the paddock and sent a crow out of the tree line in a burst of black wings and loud complaint. He reached out. His hand, broad as a paddle, brushed a curl of wood, shaving off her shoulder. Not the way he moved tools or timber, the way you touched something you'd stopped categorizing as separate from your own concerns. Ruth went still for exactly 1 second under the touch. Then she settled, just slightly. Like something finding its balance. I'll hitch the wagon, he said. He walked toward the paddock, and behind him, very quietly, so quietly he almost missed it under the sound of the mill and the river and the cold Wyoming wind, Ruth Calloway said. All right then, 2 words. Not much by most accounts, but from Ruth Calloway. Those 2 words meant yes, and good, and I'll be here when you get back, which, for a man who had spent 8 years making certain, there was nobody to come back to, landed with the weight of something considerably larger than 2 words had any right to carry. The thaw came in February like a debt being called in, not gently, not the way polite seasons changed in places that had the luxury of being polite about it. The Wyoming thaw arrived hard and fast and without apology, cracking the river ice in great groaning sheets that rode the current downstream and took the snow with them in gray slurried waves. The Laramie swelled, then kept swelling, then became something that had opinions about where it wanted to go and the force to act on them. The water wheel caught all of it. The paddles that had turned slowly and deliberately through the shallow winter current now spun with a mechanical fury that made the whole structure vibrate at a frequency you felt in the soles of your boots. The mill race channeled that fury into the gear system. The gear system delivered it to the saw blade, and the saw blade, 24 inches of American steel running at full operational speed on a swollen spring river, became something that made even Wade Harlan stand back and look at it for a moment before he put a log on the carriage. They ran 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, because Ruth drew the line at Sunday. Not out of any particular affection for Reverend Stanton's theology. Because the machinery needed the rest, and so did the horses, and so frankly did the hands of everyone involved, which were accumulating a record of cuts and calluses and rope burns that told the story of the winter in a language anyone could read. The lumber stack grew, then kept growing, then stopped being a stack and became something closer to a small mountain range, organized in rows by species and dimension, each row labeled in Ruth's system of notches on the end posts. A code she could read by touch and that Wade had memorized by sight. Ponderosa pine for framing, Douglas fir for flooring, dense, tight-grained lodgepole for anything structural. All of it cut to quarter-inch tolerance or better. All of it priced at 6 cents a board foot, because Ruth Calloway had set a price in December and saw no reason to change it simply because his demand had increased. Demand had increased considerably. The wagon trail from Cold Creek to the mill had been a single rutted track through mud and ice when they started. By March it was a road. Not by any official designation. By the simple mechanical fact of enough heavily loaded freight wagons passing over it, often enough to pack the earth into something hard and reliable. People were coming from the neighboring valleys, not to Cold Creek, past it, directly up the road to the mill, bypassing the mercantile and the bank, and the entire self-appointed economic center of a small, stagnant world. They came with cash and orders written on folded paper, and sometimes with nothing written down at all. Just a man on a horse who had heard from another man on a horse that the Calloway Harlan mill had the straightest cut timber in 50 miles, and the woman who ran it didn't extend credit but also didn't cheat you. Which in the Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1884 was considered a form of civic virtue. Ruth conducted business from the heavy oak chair Wade had built for her in January, positioned just outside the mill doors where she could hear everything. The river behind her, the blade inside, the wagon wheels on the road coming up from the valley. She could tell from the sound of the wheels how heavy the load was. Could tell from the pattern of footsteps approaching who was coming and roughly what they wanted. She was never wrong. She was also, and this was the part that Cold Creek was only beginning to understand, completely indifferent to whether you liked her or not. Business was business. Grudges were an emotional luxury that cost money and produced nothing. She did not carry them, but she did not offer discounts, not to anyone, not under any circumstances, not for any reason that had ever been presented to her, and a considerable variety had been attempted. Silas Pruitt was drowning, not literally, though Wade had contemplated the poetic justice of that outcome and found it satisfying in a way he didn't examine too closely. Pruitt was drowning in the economic shift the mill had produced, which was in some ways a more complete kind of drowning. The kind that happened slowly, where you didn't realize how much water you were in until you tried to take a step and found the ground wasn't where you'd left it. Pruitt's bank had operated for 11 years on a model that was simple and that worked. Cold Creek was isolated. Settlers needed loans. Pruitt set the rates. When the harsh reality of Wyoming Territory broke a settler, which it did with reliable regularity, because Wyoming Territory was not a place that adjusted its requirements to personal circumstances, Pruitt foreclosed, took the land, resold it or kept it, or used the leverage to extract further concessions from the next person who needed money. It worked because the isolation made it work. If you needed money and Pruitt was the only money, you paid what Pruitt asked. But Ruth's mill was putting hard currency directly into the hands of people who hadn't seen hard currency in years. Cash for lumber, cash for milling services, cash that bypassed the bank entirely and went into pockets and strong boxes and the undersides of loose floorboards where Pruitt's interest rates couldn't reach it. People who had hard currency did not need loans. People who did not need loans did not need Silas Pruitt. Pruitt was aware of all of this. He had spent the winter watching it develop and calculating his response. He was not a stupid man. He was a corrupt one, which was different, and in some ways more dangerous, because corrupt men who were also intelligent tended to be creative about their methods. He had tried the debt trap. It hadn't worked. He had tried the sabotage. It hadn't worked. He had tried waiting for the whole thing to collapse under its own ambition, which was working least of all. So on a gray Tuesday morning in late March, when the mud was deep and honest about it, and the river was still running high from the snowmelt. Pruitt rode up the mill road. He did not come alone. The man riding beside Pruitt wore a silver star on a heavy buffalo coat and the expression of someone who had been briefed on a situation and was being paid to have an opinion about it. Deputy Morrow, out of the county seat, big through the shoulders in a professional way, built by years of needing to be the largest thing in most rooms. He was about to discover that some rooms had different requirements. They pulled up at the edge of the mill yard. Wade was inside, filing the saw blade. A long, precise job that required focusing on each individual tooth, and which he had been doing for 2 hours, and which was now interrupted by the sound of unfamiliar horses on his road. He set the file down, stepped out. Ruth was already outside. She was standing in front of the mill doors with her hickory cane planted in the mud, and her face turned toward the sound of the approaching horses with the focused attention of someone who had been tracking those hoofbeats since the bottom of the road and had formed preliminary conclusions. Ruth Pruitt's voice had changed since October. The comfortable authority was present, but the floor had gone out of it, something thinner underneath. The voice of a man performing certainty he no longer felt all the way through. Call off your man. We're here on county business. Wade came around the corner of the mill. He moved the way he always moved, without hurry and without announcement, and positioned himself between Pruitt and Ruth. Not dramatically. Just there, where he was going to stay. Pruitt pulled a folded document from his coat, held it out like it was a weapon, because in the right county, with the right judge it sometimes was. Injunction, signed by the circuit judge in Cheyenne. You are operating an illegal obstruction on a navigable waterway. The water wheel violates downstream water rights. This mill shuts down immediately, pending a federal survey. He smiled. The smile of a man who had thought this particular move through carefully. Federal surveys take 12 to 18 months, standard procedure, which means you are out of business through next spring. And since your operating license is contingent on active production, read the property description, Ruth said. Her voice cut through his recitation like a blade through green pine, flat, clean, no wasted edge. Pruitt's smile stayed. Morrow? Deputy Morrow took the injunction and looked at the bottom of the document with the careful attention of a man who understood that legal papers had teeth and wanted to be sure whose leg they were aimed at. Section 4, Township 9, Range 12. Stop there, Ruth said. Morrow stopped, Section 4. She tapped her cane against the mud once, like punctuation. That is Thomas's original 50-acre plot, adjacent to the road. The parcel that Silas foreclosed on for back taxes last October. Pruitt's smile widened. Exactly, and the mill sits on it. The mill does not sit on it. She turned. Not away from Pruitt, toward the granite outcropping that pushed up through the mud 50 yards from the mill wall, where the ground changed character, where the river's historical flood boundary ended and the rocky high ground began. She pointed her cane at it. When Thomas laid his foundation, she said, he built on the mud flat, 20 feet from the flood line, which is why the frame rotted, which is why there was nothing left standing by the time Wade and I arrived. She turned back toward Pruitt. Her blind eyes found his face with the accuracy that had stopped startling people only because they had learned to expect it. When we laid our foundation, we moved it. 15 paces inland, up onto the granite, away from the flood line, away from Thomas's original plot. Pruitt said nothing, because Pruitt was beginning to understand the mathematics of what she was telling him. We did not build on Section 4, she continued. The quieter her voice became, the worse it was for the person she was addressing. Wade had learned this about her over the winter. The volume and the danger moved in opposite directions, always. We built on Section 5, the rocky, worthless, unclaimed high ground that nobody in this valley had filed on, because it looked like it had nothing valuable on it. She reached into the pocket of her wool skirt, produced a folded document of her own. The day after Wade paid off my debt, she said, I gave a letter to the Morning Courier, addressed to the Federal Land Office in Cheyenne, filing a homestead claim on Section 5, Township 9, Range 12. She held the document out toward Morrow, not toward Pruitt. That is the confirmation. Dated October 16, 1883. The claim was recorded and granted November 2nd. Morrow took the paper. He read it. He read it again. The sound he made was not quite a word. It was the sound of a professional man realizing he had ridden 40 miles in mud season to enforce an injunction against a piece of ground that had nothing on it except mud. Pruitt had gone the color of cold ash. He was looking at the mill, at its position, at the granite outcropping, at the distance between the two, and the distance was 15 paces. Exactly, measured and deliberate and planned the same night Ruth had laid her rope grid in the frozen dark. The same night she had known, with the certainty of someone who had spent years thinking about this specific problem, that Pruitt would come for the land eventually, that he would use whatever legal mechanism he could find, that the mechanism would depend on where the structure sat, and that where the structure sat was, therefore, the entire game. She had moved the mill 15 paces inland on the second day she was on the property, not just for structural integrity. For this moment, this exact moment, your injunction applies to an empty patch of mud where my husband's rotting timber frame used to be, Ruth said. Her voice had gone somewhere precise and final. You are welcome to it, Pruitt turned tomorrow. That document could be forged. The claim could be. It was recorded by the Federal Land Office, Morrow said. He folded the confirmation and handed it back to Ruth, who took it and returned it to her pocket without expression. I am not going to stand in this yard and tell a woman her federal land grant is forged, Pruitt. That is a conversation for lawyers and judges, and I am neither. If you want to contest it, you hire an attorney and you go to Cheyenne. She planned this. Pruitt's voice had shed the performance entirely. What remained was simpler and uglier. She set this up from the beginning. Yes, Wade said. Just that one word. Pruitt looked at him. She planned it, Wade said, from the first night. With string and wooden stakes in the dark, while the whole town was busy deciding how the story was going to end, he let that sit for a moment. The way you let a statement sit when it didn't need decoration. You looked at a blind woman standing in a mercantile and decided she was already finished. She wasn't finished, Pruitt. She was getting started. Pruitt's mouth opened. Closed. Get off my property, Wade said. Not loudly. He never needed to be loud. The volume was the same he used to call measurements through the noise of the operating mill. Conversational, practically, but it had the weight of everything behind it, and everyone present understood that Deputy Morrow made a decision. The decision was visible in the way his hand moved toward his side arm, and then very deliberately moved away from it. In the way he looked at Wade Harlan and performed a rapid assessment, and concluded that his county salary covered a great many things, but not this specific situation on this specific morning. This is a land records dispute, Morrow said. He folded the injunction, tucked it in his coat. You want to contest the homestead claim, you go through the proper channels. I'm done here. He turned his horse and rode back down the road without looking back. Pruitt stood in the mud. He was alone. And for perhaps the first time since Wade had watched him perform his cruelty in the mercantile in October, Silas Pruitt looked precisely like what he was. A man in an expensive suit standing in mud that was getting into his boots. A man who had used paper and leverage and other people's weakness as instruments for so long that he had forgotten what it felt like to run out of them. He looked at Ruth. At the blind woman standing in front of her mill with her cane in the mud, and her scarred hands at her sides, and her face turned toward him with those pale eyes that could not see him, and somehow saw him completely. You won't last the year, he said. The venom had drained out of it. What was left was just the shape of the threat without the substance. We already lasted the winter, Ruth said. She turned away from him, toward the mill, toward the work that was waiting inside it, and the day that was still going and the season that had only just started. Wade, fire up the carriage. We have orders to fill. She walked inside. Wade watched Pruitt for a moment. Long enough to be clear about who was still standing and who needed to leave. Then he turned and followed Ruth into the mill. Behind them the wheel turned. The river ran. The blade picked up where it had left off, because the river did not stop for Silas Pruitt, and neither did anything else on this ridge anymore. And Silas Pruitt stood in the mud of the road for another few moments before he climbed back on his horse and rode back down to Cold Creek, occupying considerably less space than he had on the way up. May came, the valley bloomed in the extravagant, apologetic way Wyoming spring bloom happened, as if the landscape, having been so brutal for so long, was making amends all at once. Wildflowers on the hillsides, the aspens putting out their first nervous green, the Laramie running clean and fast and full, turned the particular blue-gray that meant snowmelt from high elevation. The road to the mill was busy every day, not just Cold Creek customers, valley neighbors. Ranchers from 15 miles out who had heard. homesteaders needing lumber to repair what the winter had taken from them. The road that had been a track in October was now packed hard by constant use, and the stack of finished lumber beside the mill was being depleted and replenished in a rhythm that had taken on the quality of something permanent. Ruth had sent a letter in February, when the snow was still deep and the idea of a railroad survey crew needing timber was not yet a fact but was, by her calculation, a logical certainty. The northern route was being graded for rail. The crew would need structural timber for bridge sections crossing the creek beds as they worked through the pass. She had written to the survey company's field office in Cheyenne, described the mill, the capacity, the blade specifications, the daily output on a working river. They wrote back in April they wanted the entire summer yield, pre-purchased, cash advance against delivery. The number they offered was the kind of number that, when Ruth read it aloud by tracing the digits on Wade's palm, because the letter had arrived while he was running the mill, and she had already memorized it, caused him to stop moving for a full 4 seconds, which was, for Wade Harlan, the equivalent of fainting. That's the whole summer, he said. And the fall, if we bring on 2 more men, we can't pay 2 more men up front. We don't need to. She had already worked through this. He could tell from the pace at which she answered, which was the pace of someone presenting a conclusion rather than reaching one. We pay them from the advance. I hire them Monday. You manage them. I run the books. You already run the books. Then I'll run larger books. She turned back toward the cabin. Monday, he hired the men on Monday, Hank Rosser, who was reliable and quiet and had the useful quality of not needing to be told the same thing twice, and a younger man named Garrett, who had the look of someone who had done a considerable amount of reconsidering over the winter and was hoping the people around him had shorter memories than he deserved. Wade had not hired them based on whether they deserved fresh starts. He had hired them based on whether they could work. They could work. He managed them the way he managed everything, without speeches and without cruelty, and with the complete and consistent expectation that the work would be done correctly. If a man said a log was too heavy to move alone, Wade would walk over, shoulder it without comment, and point in the direction it needed to go. Nobody said a log was too heavy twice. Nobody said much of anything twice after the first week, because the first week was sufficient education. Cold Creek had been changing since December. But the change had been happening the way underground water changed a landscape, invisibly, structurally, at the level where things held together or didn't. By May the change had broken the surface, the center of gravity had shifted, the invisible social weight that determined where things happened and where decisions got made and whose voice carried authority in a small isolated community had moved, away from Pruitt's mahogany desk, up the mill road. People who had decisions to make came up the road to make them. People who wanted to know which direction things were going came up the road to look at the railroad contract confirmation nailed to the outside of the mill wall, and the 2 hired men working the secondary log yard and the blind woman in the oak chair who ran all of it. They did not always speak to Ruth directly. They didn't need to. They just needed to see that the mill was real, that the woman was real, that the whole thing they had been laughing at since October was in fact a going concern that had pre-sold its entire summer production to a railroad company while they were busy deciding it was doomed. That was information enough. Reverend Stanton came on the last Friday of May. He came for siding planks for the church edition he had been planning for 2 years and deferring for lack of funds. He came alone, no congregation behind him for audience, just the Reverend and his horse and his hat held in his hands, which was unusual enough on its own. Ruth heard him coming from the bottom of the road. She was in the oak chair, working on the account ledger with the system she had developed for tracking figures by touch. Specific notch patterns in the page margins corresponding to amounts and dates, cross-referenced with the mental index she maintained as easily as breathing. She didn't look up, Reverend, she said. Ruth, he dismounted, cleared his throat. Mrs. Calloway, I want to say first that the Lord works in ways we don't always anticipate, and that I believe 6 cents a board foot, she said. Silver, a pause waited with the specific gravity of a man swallowing several things at once. I was hoping, given the circumstances of our history, that some consideration might be. The church expansion, Ruth set her notching tool down. You've been planning it for 2 years. You have the donations in your building fund. I know because Hank Ross's wife sits on the fund committee and Hank talks while he works. She turned towards Stanton. 6 cents, Reverend. Silver. Same price as everyone else who has come up this road. Stanton's jaw worked. I offered you shelter in difficult circumstances. You offered me a cot in a basement. Her voice was entirely pleasant. The pleasantness of someone holding cards they didn't need to show. I think we both know those are different things. And I think we both know that you know we both know that. She picked up the notching tool again. 6 cents. Silver. Or you can see whether the lumber from Laramie arrives before the rain does. He paid 6 cents a board foot in silver. He did not attempt to negotiate the delivery fee. Wade watched the whole exchange from inside the mill door, leaning against the frame with his arms crossed, and found it one of the more satisfying commercial transactions he had witnessed in his life. Which was saying something, considering the winter they'd had. Pruitt sold the bank that spring. It happened without announcement and without ceremony, which suited the nature of the exit. He filed the transfer papers with the county in April, packed his personal effects, and relocated to Cheyenne, citing better opportunities, which was the phrase a man used when he couldn't say the accurate phrase, which was that he had been outmaneuvered by a blind woman with a ball of twine and had run out of moves. The man who bought the bank was named Marchetti, from Denver. Direct and fair-haired, with the practical manner of someone who had grown up in commerce rather than grown into power. He visited the mill on his second day in Cold Creek, which told Wade everything he needed to know about the man's instincts. He brought a bottle of decent bourbon. Ruth told him to save the bourbon for a celebration and tell her his interest rates. He laughed. They did business. He extended an operating line of credit on terms that made Pruitt's former rates look like what they were. Summer settled into the valley and stretched out long and warm. The days lengthened until the light lasted past 8 o'clock, and the mill ran in that long golden evening light that made the sawdust hanging in the air look like something from a different kind of story than the one they were actually in. The railroad crew came and went in stages, picking up lumber by the wagon load and leaving receipts that Ruth filed by touch in the wooden box under the counting table. Garrett, the younger hired man, turned out to have an instinct for the gear mechanism that went beyond what Wade had expected when he hired him. He could hear a misalignment in the drivetrain before it registered as a problem anywhere else, which was a skill Ruth recognized and compensated accordingly. She gave him a raise after 6 weeks without being asked or prompted. He didn't mention it either. He just started showing up 15 minutes early and applying the same attention to the secondary shaft that he'd been applying to the primary. The oak chair outside the mill doors had become, by midsummer, something between an office and a fixed point of navigation. People driving past used it as a landmark. Turn left at the mill woman's chair, past the Callaway Harlan place. You'll see the wheel, always turning. The work had settled into its rhythm, and its rhythm had settled into both of them in ways that neither had anticipated and neither had discussed. There were things they did without being asked. Wade rebuilt the fire every morning before Ruth was awake, because she found cold mornings harder since the blindness, and she had mentioned this once in November, and once was enough. Ruth kept track of the tool inventory in her head, and told him before he realized something was missing, which saved him the trip to find it. He had stopped being startled by this somewhere around January. They had a language, not the one built from words, the one built from months of working beside a person until their habits were as familiar as your own, until the particular sound of their footsteps told you their mood before they reached the door, until the way they held a piece of timber told you what they were thinking about it before they said anything at all. Wade had not had this with anyone in a long time. He was aware of that. He had been aware of it since approximately December, and the awareness had not faded with familiarity the way he had initially assumed it would. It had done the opposite. On a Thursday evening in late August, in the stillness that came over the mill yard after the hired men had cleared out, and the machinery had wound down, and everything was quiet except the river and the cooling tick of the gear housing, Wade was wiping down the main drive components with a grease rag when he heard Ruth's cane on the floorboards. He heard before he saw her that her gait was different, not the brisk, purposeful stride of someone moving between tasks. Something slower, more deliberate. The walk of a person carrying something they had been carrying for a while and had decided it was time to put down. She appeared in the mill doorway. She was holding something. Her hands were at her sides, but differently than usual. There was a quality to her stillness that he had not seen before, and he had spent 8 months learning the vocabulary of how she stood. "Wade," she said. He set the grease rag down. She didn't move farther into the mill. She stayed in the doorway, her cane in the mud outside, the evening light behind her. "The doctor came through from Laramie on Monday," she said. "While you were up on the ridge checking the timber stands, something in his chest arranged itself differently." He waited. "He came through for the Rogers family. Their youngest." A pause. The particular kind of pause that held the actual thing inside it. "I asked him to look at something for me while he was here." What something? It was not a question. It was a space left open for her to fill. "I've been tired," she said. "And certain things have been different than they were before." She was choosing words with a care that was unusual even for her, and she was always careful. He confirmed what I had already been calculating. Another pause. Shorter this time. Like she had decided to stop approaching it and simply say it. "February." If his estimate is right, Wade sat down on the workbench, not intentionally. His legs made the decision without consulting him. "February." He looked at his hands. At the grease worked into the creases of his knuckles and the scars across his right palm from a trap spring that had misfired 8 winters ago, and the calluses built by years of the kind of work that left its record on a man's skin, whether he wanted it recorded or not. He thought about the cabin on the ridge, the 2 small graves on the hill behind it, the fever that had come in the winter of 1875 and moved through everything he had built his life around in 11 days. He thought about the decision he had made afterward, quietly and without announcement, that the way to survive losing things was to stop accumulating them. To keep himself at a distance from anything that could be taken. He had been wrong about that. He had known he was wrong about it for months. Since at least December, if he was being accurate, which he preferred to be. He had simply been waiting for a moment that felt like the right one to acknowledge it fully. And he was aware, sitting on the workbench in the evening light with the mill quiet around him, and Ruth standing in the doorway, that this was that moment whether he was ready for it or not. "The east wall of the cabin," he said. Ruth turned toward his voice. "It catches the morning sun earliest," he said. "If we extend the cabin on the east side, add another room off that wall, it would get the best light in the mornings. Warm by the time anyone needed to be in it." Ruth was quiet. "I should have fixed that east wall in September anyway," he said. "The chinking let cold in all winter. That's on me," still quiet. "And the road needs grading before October," he said. "If we're going to have a doctor's wagon coming up here with any regularity, it needs to be wider at the bottom bend. The turn is too tight as it sits." Ruth made a sound. He looked at her. She had her hand over her mouth. Her shoulders were moving. "Are you laughing?" he said. "No," she said, in the clear voice of someone who was absolutely laughing. "I'm being practical. I told you we were having a baby," she said, "and your first response was wall chinking. The wall chinking is directly relevant to the situation." "The wall chinking," she said, "is the least romantic thing I have heard in 8 months of living with a man who communicates primarily through axe swings, and I lived with Thomas Calloway for 6 years. And Thomas once expressed his love for me by reshoeing my horse without being asked and considered that sufficient. That's a reasonable way to express it. Wade? What? Come here." He stood up from the workbench, crossed the mill floor to the doorway where she stood, stopped close enough that she could find him without reaching. She reached up and put her hands on his chest, both of them, palms flat over the worn canvas of his shirt, feeling his breathing. The particular rhythm of it that she had learned the way she had learned everything about him, through attention and repetition and the accumulated knowledge of proximity. "I know you're not a man who says things," she said, quietly, without accusation, just the plain statement of a fact she had known since October and had never required him to be otherwise. "I know you show what you mean through what you do, I know that. I have known it since you tucked a receipt into my pocket in a mercantile and then walked away like you hadn't just changed everything." He put his hands over hers. "I need to tell you something," he said. She waited. "I had a wife. And a son." He said it the way he did most things, without preamble or softening, because the truth was the truth and dressing it up, in other words, didn't change its shape. 8 years ago. The fever took them both. 11 days. I didn't have the money for the doctor from Laramie, and by the time I did, it was 11 days too late. Her hands pressed slightly harder against his chest. I went up to the ridge after that because I decided it was safer, that the distance was protection, that if there was nothing close to me, there was nothing that could be taken. He looked at the top of her head, at the dark hair wound back from her face, at the particular way she held herself when she was listening to something important, which was the same way she held herself when she was listening to everything. I was wrong. About the distance, about all of it, and I have known I was wrong for a while now. How long, she said. December, he said. Approximately. She made a sound that was almost a laugh and almost something else. And the reason I know, he said, is that in November you let out one short laugh when I paid off Pruitt's loan. And I was up on the ridge for half a day and I kept hearing it. And I thought, that is a problem for a man who has decided he doesn't want anything close to him. And then I thought, it is possible that man made a poor decision, Ruth laughed. The real one. The full one, tipping her head back slightly, the evening light catching the line of her jaw and the scars on her hands, and the particular brightness that came into her face when she stopped managing herself and just was herself. I'm glad it's February, Wade said. I'm glad it's you. I'm glad the east wall needs fixing because now I have to do it properly instead of the way I patched it in October, which I knew at the time was insufficient. Wade, what? Stop talking about the wall. He cupped her face in both hands. His thumbs traced the high lines of her cheekbones, the weathered skin around her sightless eyes, the jaw that had stayed set through every piece of bad news Silas Pruitt had ever tried to deliver. He kissed her, not the first time, not by several months. But each time had been different, had added something to the account they kept of each other. And this time what it added was permanence. The quality of something that had stopped being tentative and become certain of itself. Rooted. Like a mill foundation sunk into granite, Ruth's hands moved from his chest to his collar, pulling him down toward her, anchoring herself against him with the same grip that had once held a 1,000-pound log suspended over a drowning man in a freezing river. When they stepped back, the sun had gone behind the ridge. The sky was the deep late summer blue that lasted about 20 minutes in Wyoming before the stars began to appear at the edges, and the evening star was already out over the eastern peaks. The east wall, Wade said. She exhaled slowly. Yes, the east wall and the road grading and the road grading. She bent and picked up her cane from where it had fallen at some point without either of them noticing. And you should tell Garrett his work on the secondary shaft has been above standard. He thinks you haven't noticed. I noticed in July. Then tell him before September or he'll assume you haven't. Noting that, and the east room needs a window on the south side, she said. Not just the east wall. South light, too, for the afternoons. South window, east room. He turned back toward the mill to close up the machinery for the night. Anything else? She considered. The cot in the main room is too narrow. He stopped. For 3 people, she said. He stood with his back to her for a moment. Then he turned around. She was standing in the mill yard in the last of the August light, her cane in the mud, her face turned toward him with her pale eyes and her absolute and characteristic certainty. I'll build a proper bed frame this weekend, he said. Good. She started toward the cabin. Come to supper before the light goes completely. Hank left half a venison haunch this afternoon. When did Hank? He left it by the door. He knows about the railroad contract. He's hoping to stay on through winter. A pause. He should. He's reliable. Wade closed up the mill and banked the fire in the forge and checked the sluice gate and did the 12 other things that closing the mill for the night required. And by the time he came into the cabin, the fire was going and supper was on, and Ruth was at the table with the account ledger, her fingers moving over the notched margins in the lamplight, tracking numbers he couldn't read in a system nobody else in the county could either. He sat down across from her. The cabin was warm. The venison smelled like someone had thought about what they were doing when they prepared it. Outside the river ran and the wheel rested, and the road sat packed and wide under the first stars, ready for whatever came up it. He watched her work. He had spent 8 years in the absolute quiet of the high timberline, and he had believed the quiet was what he needed. The absence of things that could be lost. The safety of nothing. He had been wrong about the quiet, too. Winter came back in October with the reliability of everything Wyoming did, but by the time the first serious snow arrived, the east room was framed and chinked and roofed with split shakes, solid and warm and facing exactly the right direction. The cabin sat on its granite foundation without moving. The mill sat on its granite foundation without moving. The road had been graded at the bottom bend and graveled where it needed it, wide enough for a doctor's wagon from Laramie or anything else that needed to get through. The hired men had been kept on through winter. Garrett on the machinery, Hank on the log yard. The mill ran shorter hours when the river slowed in the deep cold, but it ran. The railroad contract carried them through with enough margin that Ruth had opened a proper account at Marchetti's bank by December, the first time she had trusted a bank in Cold Creek with anything since Thomas died. Marchetti had noted this without comment. He was a man who understood that trust was a currency and treated it accordingly. The work continued. The orders came up the road, and the finished lumber went down it, and the account ledger filled in its notched margins with the record of a business that had stopped needing to prove itself and simply was. Ruth managed the books and the pricing and the customer negotiations with the systematic efficiency of someone who had never once in her life confused busyness with productivity. Wade managed the machinery and the men and the physical reality of a sawmill operating on a cold Wyoming river with the quiet competence of someone who had been making difficult things work in difficult conditions since before most of the hired men in the valley had been old enough to swing an axe. They were good at different things. Their things fit together. This had been true in October, and it was more true in February, and it did not appear to be moving in any direction except further in the same one. On a morning in February that came in cold and clear and certain of itself, the doctor's wagon made it up the road without difficulty. The road was wide and well graded, and the surface had been kept clear of ice by Wade, who had been checking it every morning since November, because he had told Ruth in August that he would see to the road, and he had seen to it. Because that was how he did things, Wade was outside when the doctor arrived. He had been outside since before dawn, which was where the doctor's assistant had firmly suggested he go when she arrived the previous evening, and which he had agreed to without resistance. Because Ruth had asked him to, and that was sufficient reason. He had spent the hours since then doing things with his hands. He had re-chinked the north wall. He had split enough cordwood to last until April. He had sharpened 4 axes, 2 of which had not needed sharpening. Then he had stood in the February cold and watched the stars go out one by one as the dawn came up and listened to the river running quiet under its skin of ice. And he had thought about the winter of 1875 and the 2 graves on the hill and the 11 days and the doctor he had not been able to afford in time. He had stood with all of that, had let it be what it was, had not put it away or diminished it or pretended it had been anything other than what it had been, and then the sound came from inside the cabin, small, indignant, entirely new to the world. The particular sound of someone who had just arrived and already had opinions about the situation. He stopped, set down the axe he had been holding, without particularly noticing he was holding it. Stood in the February cold with his breath making slow clouds in the still air, and the snow on the ground catching the early light, and the wheel not turning for once, simply resting, the way all things needed to rest sometimes, so they could turn again. The door opened. The doctor's assistant leaned out. She looked at him with the expression of someone who had just participated in something that had gone exactly as it should have. "Mr. Harlan." "You can come in now," he went in. Ruth was in the bed in the east room, the one facing the morning sun, the one with the south window for afternoon light. Her hair was loose. Her face held the specific exhaustion of someone who had done a very large thing and was now resting in the aftermath of it, and in her arms, wrapped in the flannel she had cut and sewn by touch the previous September, measuring and cutting by feel with the same precision she brought to everything, was something very small and very loud and very present in its own existence. Wade stood in the doorway. He was a man who had seen the Wyoming high country in all 4 seasons for 8 years running, who had built things that stood and watched things fall and kept going regardless, because regardless was what you did, who had faced the charging grizzly and the flash flood and the winter that starved lesser men, and had come through all of them by virtue of the refusal to stop. He had not expected this, not the weight of it, not the specific gravity of standing in the doorway of a room that was warm and full of firelight and contained, in the space of a few feet, more of what mattered than he had allowed himself to stand close to in 8 years. Ruth opened her eyes, found him in the doorway, "Come here," she said. He came in, sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress he had built on the proper frame he had built the previous September, wide enough for 3 people, Ruth had noted when he finished it, and he had not said anything to that because he hadn't needed to. The baby was looking at the ceiling with the focused, unfocused intensity of someone encountering entirely new information and attempting to process it all at once. "She's extremely loud," Ruth said. "Takes after you. I am not loud. You can be occasionally loud when the situation calls for it." Ruth almost smiled. "The doctor said she's healthy, everything as it should be." "Good." He looked at the baby. At the ceiling she was studying. "She's checking the structure," he said. "First thing, making sure it holds, of course she is." Ruth shifted carefully. "The east wall holds fine. Morning light exactly as you calculated." "I know." A pause. "I could feel the angle of it this morning. Before. I knew it was right, it is." Silence settled in the room. Not the silence of absence. The silence of a space that was full enough not to need filling. "What do we call her?" he said. Ruth had thought about this. He could tell from the pace of her answer, which was the pace of someone presenting a conclusion rather than reaching one, that she had been carrying this for a while and had been waiting for the right moment to put it down. "June," she said. "After the month Thomas and I came to this valley, before the river, before the fever, before everything went wrong," she turned toward him. "Not for Thomas, for the valley itself, for what this place was before it decided we didn't belong in it, and for what we made it into." He sat with that. "June Harlan," he said. Her pale eyes found his face. "June Harlan." She agreed. He reached out and put one hand over both of hers where they held the baby. His hand was twice the size of both of hers together. His hand that had swung an axe and set an axle in a freezing river, and laid granite foundation stones in frozen ground, and built a room facing east for morning light, and graded a road every morning for 3 months so a doctor's wagon could get through. The baby made a sound, not a complaint exactly, more of an announcement, the announcement of someone who had arrived and intended to be known about. "All right," Wade said to her specifically. "All right, we hear you." The baby appeared to consider this response and find it acceptable. The volume decreased slightly. The ceiling remained under close observation. Outside, Cold Creek went about its February morning in the cold. The people who had laughed in the Methodist church vestibule in October were building their houses with Callaway Harlan lumber and sending their children to a school that sat on a Callaway Harlan board foundation and conducting their commerce on roads that led past the Callaway Harlan mill, which turned on a river that had never cared, not once in all its running, about what anyone in the valley thought was possible. The river just ran. The wheel would turn again in spring. And in the east room of the cabin on the granite ridge, in the morning light that came through exactly as calculated, a woman who had spent 3 years building an empire in the dark held the proof that the dark was over. And the man who had walked into a mercantile in October and done one honest, impulsive thing sat beside them both and held everything. The town of Cold Creek, Wyoming territory, had laughed when the mountain man chose the blind widow. They had been wrong, dead wrong. Because they had looked at 2 people the world had already written off and seen only the ending they expected. They had not seen what was actually there. They had not seen a woman who had been designing a future in the dark for 3 years, waiting for one person to hand her the other end of the rope. They had not seen a man who had been living at a distance from everything that mattered, waiting without knowing he was waiting for a reason to come back down from the ridge. The mountain man and the blind widow had not frozen. They had built a fire, and they had built it to last.